Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the third episode in our webinar series, Religion and Numbers. And for those joining us for the first time, a very warm welcome to the Woolf Institute. My name is Dr. Julian Hargreaves. I'm the Director of Research here. And for those who've joined us before, welcome back. You are very, very welcome. It's good to see names again that appeared on the first two webinars, so welcome back. So this afternoon, it's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Daniel Staetsky, and it's particularly happy moment for us because Daniel is connected here to the Woolf Institute as one of our affiliated researchers, but he is during the day the director of the European Jewish Demographic Unit and a senior research fellow in the Institute for Jewish Policy Research. Now, tonight, Daniel will be speaking for about 40 minutes, and we hope to have 15 or 20 minutes or so for questions and answers. And if you do have questions during Daniel's presentation, please do feel free to write them into the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and I'll do my best to select as many as I can in the session afterwards. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to Daniel. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you and welcome. I will start by sharing my screen. The topic of my talk today is, as you see, Jewish longevity or Jewish mortality. And I will be using those terms interchangeably. The insight into the patterns of death, how people die, tell us something about how they live. I will be talking about this topic in the context of the latest health crisis, so coronavirus pandemic, and what that coronavirus pandemic can teach us about the particular subject of Jewish longevity. And my statement here, my proposition is that it can teach us a great deal. Certain things were suspected before, but they were never as clear as they are now due to this crisis. I will give you a roadmap of this presentation. I will start from the tail. I will talk about the latest health crisis first, in a way, and some contradictions that it presented to us. I will then go on to a topic of how Jewish mortality or Jewish longevity looks when things are normal, outside of the pandemic hours. And then I will conclude with some hypotheses and what's different now and what can be learned from the pandemic about Jewish mortality as a topic. How can the topic of Jewish mortality and generally study of mortality and demography can benefit from that? So how it all began, and I will basically present two things: the journalistic discourse, what happened in the world of journalistic commentary on the pandemic, and what happened in the research world, partly in response to that. So early in the course of the pandemic, the journalistic reports appeared, and they seem to have suggested that Jews affected by coronavirus more than others. And by saying more than others, I mean the impact on their health. They seem to die more than others. Some of the reports, the one that you see in front of you, had very clear catastrophic taste to them. This feature from Jewish Telegraphic Agency that was published on May, the 5th of May, 2020, said things like, in many large Jewish communities, coronavirus is wreaking terrible toll, death toll is thousands, it's climbing, it's impossible to say how many Jews died. So clearly, very catastrophic take on things. The fact that it was published in May signals to you that it was written in April, and that also signals to you that it was written at the peak of the pandemic. So perhaps it's somewhat understandable. Other reports in British press and international press indicated that something like this may be happening to other ethnic and religious groups. And in response to that, the Cabinet Office in Britain launched an initiative of an in-depth study of ethnic and religious mortality. And as a result of this development, I would say a convergence of political will on that scale with the technical capacity of the Office for National Statistics. The study that you see in front of you was published early in 2020. It was the first study on the topic of ethnic and religious differences in mortality from COVID. It was published by the Office for National Statistics, which is the chief statistical institution in the United Kingdom. What it found was effectively this study from the point of view of Jewish mortality has written a detective story. So first of all, with respect to Jews and whatever the ONS research has found, it wasn't entirely unprecedented. The British Jewish mortality in general, is a researched subject. Yet it was revolutionary. I consider it revolutionary, a very bright star in the sky of Jewish demography, because it allowed the estimation of Jewish British mortality with unmatched degree of precision. What the Office for National Statistics did was extraordinary. They took the census data, the census file from 2011, and they attached to each person in the file, found in the file, a marker which indicated whether this person died or not since the census and the cause of death. And in this way, they could document with unmatched degree of precision, as I said, the fate of every individual that was censused in Britain in 2011. And because the census data file contains data on religion and ethnicity, the analysis of mortality since 2011 could be done according to religion and ethnicity. The finding that I would like to highlight here was that Jewish mortality from COVID was found to be higher, and very significantly higher, than mortality of non-Jews, particularly Christian majority. And the amazing thing that it was found to be higher, other things being equal. That's the amazing thing. You would easily imagine that, or you may know it very well, that the census data file contains a wide array of characteristics. So things like education, place of residence, state of health of Jews could be controlled for. In this case, the ONS produced the findings that compare religious and ethnic groups when all other characteristics being controlled for. So if they found differences in mortality due to religion or due to ethnicity, these are distilled differences. They are unconfounded by differences in education or socioeconomic status. And as you can see, well, that for us, we interpreted it, the community of scholars, Jewish demographers, as a demographic detective story, no less. And why that is so, why that finding is so perplexing is, well, my humble illustration is this. What you see is the map of the world, and the red V marks that I put there basically tell you which communities, Jewish communities, have been well documented with reference to Jewish longevity, where we know with great degree of certainty how long Jews live in relation to non-Jews. So these are communities, obviously, of Israel. That's easy enough to document. But we have the good documentation in Canada, in the United States of America, in what was once the Soviet Union, and also in Europe, in particular in Britain. And what we know from that, if I have to summarize this very large body of information in one slide, we know that no matter where we look, in Soviet Union of the 80s, in Britain today, in America today, or in the 50s, Jews are long lifers, which means they live longer than non-Jews. This is particularly true about Jewish men, but that basically star at the top in the hierarchy of longevity. But it's also true of Jewish women, and what's also not very well known, that when one compares mortality of Israeli men to the rankings of mortality across the world, one finds that even the more disadvantaged groups in Israel among the Jews, the non-Ashkenazi, so Jews who originate from countries of the Middle East and North Africa, even this group has higher longevity or lower mortality than other European males. Now, this pattern has been documented. It's not new. Sometimes the documentation is patchy, the data are limiting, but if I have to, it wouldn't be exaggeration to say that we have this pattern being documented consistently for 100 years, something like 100 years. The exceptions exist, and these are typically new Jewish immigrant communities, communities of people who came from Eastern Europe to the New World. And for a while, it was observed that these communities had a higher mortality. This was understandable. This was new. This was people who came from regions with higher mortality, and that was preserved for a while. But very quickly, their mortality converged to the conditions of the new country, the hosting country, and it improved so much so that they became what's called the vanguard in terms of longevity, the group with the highest longevity in their particular context. If you ask me, well, why that is so, there are two explanations that I would like to highlight. First is almost no matter where you look, Jews, I chose to call it an advantaged group in socioeconomic terms, and an advantaged group in terms of education. So now education is a variable that's very well documented, and it's very easy to compare. What you see here is three panels, and it presents to you the differences between Jews and non-Jews in terms of education. By this, I mean having a university degree, university qualification, in three contexts: England and Wales, United States of America, and Germany. I simply chose another European country to highlight. So what you see in England and Wales, for example, that the highest educational qualifications, which was called level 4, university education, is something that 27% of adult population in England and Wales had in 2011. Among Jews, British Jews, it was 42. So it's not quite twice, but something like this, 1.5 times higher. Among the strictly Orthodox Jews, that characteristic, that proportion was lower at the level of 14%. I think that's relatively well known. But anyhow, for Jews as a whole, it was much higher. In the United States of America, the difference is even more dramatic. About 60% of American Jews have a university education. 29% in general population have it. Among strictly Orthodox Jews in America, it's a statistic that may surprise some people. Their education is very similar to the general American indicator. And the very large difference is observed in Germany. So really, no matter where we look, we see that in educational terms, Jews have superior education, and that translates in longevity advantage in non-Jewish population. So that's part of the explanation, but it's only part, it's not the whole. The other part is found in the cultural factors or behavioral factors, and what we see consistently across time and space, that Jewish people, both men and women, particularly men, but also women, have a very low component of what's called avoidable mortality. The avoidable mortality is mortality that quite literally could be avoided. It could be avoided by modifying behavior. Mortality from accidents, by and large, could be avoided. Mortality from excessive alcohol consumption, by and large, could be avoided. Drug consumption, etc. So all types of mortality that are not due to some sort of inherent changes in the body or aging, but due to certain behavioral patterns, what we see, and the reason we can document it is because the data collectors, the statistical officers of the world, the researchers, when they collect data on mortality, they collect data meticulously about the cause of death. So we can separate for each group and group mortality into avoidable and non-avoidable. And these exercises show consistently that Jews and some other groups, but particularly Jews, have the low component of mortality due to misbehavior. Why is that so? I would call that, and many researchers say that the reasons are behavioral patterns that basically arose in response to political vulnerability. And to give you an example of what it actually meant, I will take you to Immanuel Kant, no less. In front of you is a quote from Anthropology from a Pragmatic Point of View, which is a collection of his lectures. in the University of Königsberg, I must tell you on a personal note, that this book is much, much more readable and really engaging compared to other books. It's not very well known compared to other compositions that he created. And he said to us the following thing. He related specifically to drinking, excessive drinking. Women, priests, and Jews do not get drunk as a rule. At least they carefully avoid all appearances of it because their civic position is weak and they need to be guarded. Weak civic position of these three groups, women, priests, and Jews, another way of saying basically that they have some sort of cultural or political vulnerability, and they're not allowed to do what other groups are allowed to do. They're punished more severely for that. The sanctions against them are more severe. The amazing thing for me personally is that this statement has been made in 1798 without any intervening data. And up until this moment, already with data, 200 years later, the vanguard groups in terms of longevity or mortality, today we know that from demographic research, are women, priests, and Jews. Women live longer than men. Priests, both nuns and priests and monks, live longer than the populations around them. There's a body of research about that. And Jews live longer than anyone, populations surrounding them. So the patterns, the protective patterns of research arise in response to political vulnerability. They result in low avoidable mortality. These are the two explanations. I will leave them behind now, and I will go to the question of what is happening then during the COVID times. How can we marry together two of these insights? On the one hand, we know that Jewish mortality should be low, the longevity should be high. Why is it then that COVID, indeed, Jews die more than others from COVID? How is COVID different, and is it COVID or something else? In response to this question, as a result to really get some insight into that, into this absurd situation, if you wish, at JPR, Institute for Jewish Policy Research, we launched two projects. First, we did the reanalysis of Jewish mortality. We used the resources that the Office for National Statistics made available to all. And unlike the Office for National Statistics, we separated the Jewish mortality into COVID and non-COVID and compared to each other, these components of mortality to each other. This is not something that the Office for National Statistics did, so we basically added nuance on the research. We also launched a global study of Jewish mortality in which we went far and wide into all countries where there are significant Jewish communities who agreed to give us the data. And we could basically asking ourselves, is the pattern that we see in Britain repeats itself in other places? And if not, what it all means. The results of the first first phase of research, which is a reanalysis of the honest data, are in front of you, and I will explain what these are. These are ratios of Jewish to Christian death rates in the first wave of the pandemic, which is in March to May 2020, with and without COVID, and I will explain very carefully what these bars show. So if Jewish mortality is equal to mortality of non-Jews, the value, the indicator will be 1, okay? The length of the bar will be 1. If it's above 1, Jewish mortality is higher. If it's below 1, it is lower. That's how it should be read. So let us look at this part of the graph. What it shows basically is all causes of death in deep blue. And it tells you that among Jewish males during this particular period of pandemic, which is the wave number 1, mortality was higher and significantly higher than among the rest of the population in Great Britain, in England and Wales at the very least. This is something that basically honest research discovered. However, what happens if you remove coronavirus out of the picture, simply, the remaining causes of death, when you look just at them, you see then that Jewish mortality is lower and significantly lower than in the rest of the population. And of course, when you look at COVID and only COVID, you can see that Jews are indeed a very disadvantaged group specifically due to COVID, not to anything else. That's what we found. This pattern repeats itself also among females. You can see this U pattern, and also at the level, of course, of general population. So the ONS conclusions are correct, despite their absurdity, but our own results, in a way, are non-contradictory to theirs. The ONS conclusions are correct in the sense, yes, Jews have higher probability of dying from COVID. However, that sits alongside the situation where they have lower probability of dying from everything else. So that rule of relatively low Jewish mortality, which we knew about from about 100, maybe 150 years of research, holds good outside of the pandemic hours and during the pandemic hours, in fact, when it comes to non-COVID. COVID-19 managed to affect populations in such a way that it basically suppressed the underlying low mortality, making Jews appear to be disadvantaged like other minority populations, although they're not. It masked something. The question then becomes, why is that so? Now, I will leave it for now and we'll go now to the second part of the study that we conducted, which is a global study of Jewish mortality during the coronavirus pandemic. I will explain what we did and how we did it. Now, as a rule, in most countries, there's no government data on deaths by ethnicity and religion. Has a detrimental impact on research related to ethnic and religious groups. By no means, it's not about Jews, but Jews are one basically group that is in a way disadvantaged in research terms, of course. However, Jewish burials universally are handled by special burial societies. In the Hebrew term for this is Chevra Kadisha, which can be translated as a sacred society or sacred brotherhood. And many of you will know that Jewish burial is something that there's a wide array of ritualistic handling of the body that includes special prayers, that includes washing, and it includes meticulous timekeeping as well, because Jewish burials typically take place within hours after the death, single days in extreme cases. I remember very vividly a tragic death of Amy Winehouse, a British pop star who is Jewish, a young woman. Her fans had no idea about her Jewishness, and she had a very large fan base. They learned about it from the fact that her funeral was several days after the death. That's very unusual, and many people asked in Britain, where burials often take place something like 2 weeks after the death, why is that? So that's the example of basically one of the components that need to be taken into account. This timing. To keep the story short, burial societies keep all these ritualistic components. That's why they exist. In Britain, 85% of Jewish deaths are handled by burial societies within that system. So those burial societies exist everywhere in the world, and we requested data on deaths that they handled across the world, every burial society that agreed to speak to us, and we also requested data from the Statistical Authority of Israel. In each community, we asked for two things. First of all, we asked for the number of deaths in January to May 2020 to cover the first wave of the pandemic. But we also asked for something else. We asked for the monthly deaths, the monthly number of deaths before the pandemic in 2016 and 19. We did that because we wanted to create a benchmark. People die all the time. Mortality is something that happens all the time. Looking at mortality in their place in slightly different time and average across the few years gives us what we call expected number of deaths, what happened under normal circumstances, a benchmark. If the number of deaths in 2020 is higher than in that normal period, then those extra deaths can be attributed to the pandemic. We call it excess mortality method. There is an advantage to it. There is an advantage to this method over asking burial societies how many COVID deaths as such, marked as COVID, you had. COVID, especially during the first wave of pandemic was not documented very well. It was a new illness. You may have noticed at the time, during the first wave of the pandemic, all sorts of journalistic accounts, slightly conspiratorial in nature, appeared saying that the real burden of coronavirus is higher than reported. Maybe governments, Big Brother, hiding something. The conspiratorial part of it was completely wrong, but the statement that not all deaths from COVID are captured by statistics on COVID are absolutely right. And so we decided to measure the excess mortality instead of COVID mortality, and to assume that that excess mortality is a better representation of the real state of the pandemic. We believe that's true. Now, so how can we tell then how many Jews died from coronavirus on the basis of the data that I just explained? Well, I'll explain this using this table. Let's look at the first row on the table. It says Germany. It says Germany because this is represents data that I received from various burial societies across Germany. And why it is blue and something else is red and yellow, I will explain in a minute. So in Germany, in those burial societies who agreed to talk to us, the number of expected deaths, the number of deaths they handled outside of the pandemic hours was on average 118. The observed deaths during the pandemic are 114, so slightly less. The ratio of them, those observed deaths to expected deaths, the actual relationship between these figures is 1. The mortality during the pandemic time, Jewish mortality in Germany was no different from normal. For among non-Jews, it was also 1. The first wave of the pandemic was extremely, extremely light in Germany. The diagnosis of this whole situation is here. And I show here, so the impact of COVID is low. And we're saying here that there is no Jewish penalty. Jews are no different, no worse in this case, than non-Jews. And that is why I use the blue color to say things are, the epidemic, the touch of the pandemic is light and there is no Jewish penalty. Things could not be more different in Britain, and it's colored in strong red. Look at London, for example. In London, during the normal times, 325 deaths happened during that particular season, March, April, and May. In March, April, and May 2020, 664 deaths happened. That's just 2 times the normal. Among non-Jews, mortality was elevated as it was 1.7. So you can see both high impact of mortality as what we call Jewish penalty. Jews die indeed more than non-Jews. The same thing you observe, the same regularity you observe in Manchester, exactly the same, and in Scotland as well. Then there is France, Paris, and Strasbourg. These are 2 places where we looked. The situation in them is not as good as in Germany, but it was not as bad as it was in Britain. And that's why they have this intermediate status. Now, this shows you other countries, other Jewish communities that we documented. And in this case, I simply present those ratios graphically. So what you can see here is 3 patterns. We identified what we call the British pattern to honor its most typical representative of very high Jewish mortality from coronavirus and high Jewish penalty. The French intermediate pattern and the German pattern where basically nothing happened. So you can see London with the excess of 2 times among Jews, Manchester 2.7, Scotland 2. The same thing happened outside of Britain in places like Stockholm, the Jewish community of Stockholm, Jewish community of Milan, and Jewish community of Brussels. They all fit into the British pattern. The pattern observed in France is also observed in Netherlands, in the Jewish community of Amsterdam in particular, in Antwerp. So Belgium in this sense is split. There's a very different reality. There are 2 different realities in Brussels and Antwerp. In Antwerp, the victimization by COVID was significantly less. And also in Hungary, the single representative of Eastern Europe. You can see the German pattern, that German pattern where nothing happened, where the ratio was 1, was also observed in the Jewish community of Rome in Italy at that point, and in the Jewish community of Vienna. And the situation with Italy is interesting. Italy, in that sense, is also split. while Milan was affected very significantly at the time, the first wave, Rome was not, apparently was not affected at all. The last exhibit that I have summarizes absolutely everything we have on this topic, all the communities. I removed numbers from this graph completely just to show you, look at this graph like you would look at the face of a person, just to see where there's a lot of text, where there is little text. And what you can see that on the highly affected, there are quite a few communities across the world, Jewish communities that were highly affected. Some of them you have seen already: England, Scotland, Belgium, Sweden, Italy. A very highly affected community is the Jewish community of New York, also Russia, Moscow, and Spain, particularly Barcelona. And then there are quite a few communities completely unaffected, obviously Germany, that gives a name to this pattern, also Israel, and all the communities of the Scandinavian countries. And then there are quite a few communities that are in the middle: France, we could see that already, Netherlands, Belgium, and Hungary, Belgium, Antwerp. Also quite a light touch epidemic had in Canada, and in a different place in the United States we approached, which is Florida. So if I have to summarize the global experience of Jews under coronavirus pandemic in the first wave, the word is mosaic of situations, a spectrum of situations. In some places, the situation is quite similar to what happened in Britain, and there are quite a few places like this. In other places, the situation could not be different. And there are places in the middle. There is no single pattern. There is a single pattern that we could see, is that the Jewish penalty, excess among Jews over and above what non-Jews have, is observed here in this part of the panel. The stronger the pandemic, the stronger the Jewish penalty is. You can ask me now, that's the right place to say, why is that? Why is Jewish mortality from COVID elevated in the first place? Why in some places and not in others? What explains it? And the candidate explanations that existed very early on, maybe something to do with underlying Jewish vulnerability. And some people went as far as to say maybe there's a genetic susceptibility or generally poor Jewish health. Well, that kind of hypothesis, I would say, can be dismissed in semifinals. Why? Because about 100 years of research tell us that actually Jews are long lifers. If anything, you expect from them better survival from any illness. So the underlying Jewish vulnerability is not the reasonable candidate to explain anything. And we could show, using our reanalysis of the Office for National Statistic Resources, that it still holds in Britain. That pattern discovered 100 years ago and traced through those 100 years didn't just disappear because of COVID. The mortality from non-COVID is still lower. So that there's no case for Jewish vulnerability in that sense. We can also dismiss quite easily residence, the hypothesis linking it to elevated mortality from COVID to residence patterns. So that particular hypothesis says, well, Jews live in large cities. Large cities are the hubs of the pandemic, like London, like Brussels. Of course, it is expected that they're expected to have higher mortality. That is also not true because, again, the Office for National Statistics controlled all that. And we, in our global research, controlled for that by comparing Jews to non-Jews in these locations. And we could see that Jewish mortality from COVID was still higher, even with locations taken into account. Another hypothesis basically toyed with a topic of age. Maybe Jewish communities are simply older and COVID affects older people disproportionately. The fact that some communities, particularly German and Italian Jewish communities, are much older is correct, and it is also correct in the non-strictly Orthodox parts of Britain, but again, as the research had shown us from the Office for National Statistics, when we control for age, nothing changes. Jews still show significantly higher mortality from COVID. Finally, those communities that have strictly Orthodox populations, particularly Britain, but also Antwerp, a Belgian city in Antwerp, in that context, the hypothesis that was raised quite early on attributed this particular high victimization by COVID to the existence of this community. And it said the following thing: this community has large families. They have developed social connections. They have developed ritual life. They meet, eat, pray together several times a day. In this situation, COVID spreads very quickly. And not only that, some of these communities have been suspected to be less compliant with the social distancing, with the rules imposed in the context of the pandemic, and limitations, restrictions imposed in the course of the pandemic early on. So we dismissed the underlying Jewish vulnerability. We dismissed the residence patterns and their impact or age. This has been checked. I will show you now very briefly that the Haredi factor can also be dismissed. And what is basically I'm showing here is the data for Britain that gives you the proportion of people who are Haredi by age group. British Jewish community is a unique community in the sense that this community is very advanced down the path of demographic desecularization. This initially small, strictly Orthodox community grew very significantly, and today they constitute about 20% of British Jews, a very significant proportion. They expected to become a majority by 2050. However, and that's very, very important, it is a very fertile and very young population. And among those groups that are most affected by the pandemic, which is 65 years and over, the proportion of strictly Orthodox among Jews is about 4 to 5%. Okay, it's very much higher among the young. So among people who are, for example, 0 to 4, 5 to 9 years old, the proportion of strictly Orthodox children out of total number of Jewish children is about close to 30%. Today it's even higher. But as we go up with age, the proportion drops. So in these groups that suffer from coronavirus, the strictly Orthodox are a very small population. As a matter of arithmetical necessity, they cannot exercise any significant impact on Jewish mortality as a whole. So it's not the Haredi. It doesn't even matter whether strictly Orthodox or Haredi die more or less from COVID. No matter what they do, they're not strong enough numerically to impact on that pattern. Having dismissed all that, now you will ask me, so what are we left with then? Okay, what are we left with then? And our hypothesis now that we could not, due to the lack of data, I should say, decisively prove, but we found a lot of support for, is that perhaps Jewish populations in places with Jewish penalty simply had greater prevalence of infection. And that, not susceptibility of Jews, but greater prevalence of infection to start with, is what created the higher mortality. The question is that why there is greater prevalence of infection, and our hypothesis is that it's a greater sociability of Jews. Let us remember that we collected data from Jewish communities, from burial societies, and one thing, there's a degree of selectivity in this data. It doesn't represent 100% of Jews. It represents population of Jews who are more involved in Jewish ritual. And Jewish ritual and Jewish communal life are built in such a way that people spend with each other a lot of time. They eat together, they pray together, they sing together. Before the service starts, they come and hug each other and kiss each other. The ritualistic components, the consumption of food, the general social togetherness are intertwined together. And that sociability is what drives the prevalence of this extremely contagious condition. Normally, sociability, multiplicity of social ties is linked to lower mortality. When I say normally, it's under the regime without COVID, where most people die from cancer or cardiovascular diseases. Sociability is an asset. It's a source of help, of consolation, of practical help. Not so with contagious diseases. With contagious diseases, it comes with a price, a heavy price of being able to transfer the virus from one person to another. I will show you just one aspect of social life of Jews, of ritual life, which I believe is not at all known as much as it should be. If you ask me today, what's the church attendance rate in the United Kingdom, for example, or in Scandinavian countries, in Belgium, how many people attend church weekly? I will tell you that the Pew Research Center analysis, it's a very large institution that surveys religious life and habit across the world. Their analysis discovered that the proportion of regular churchgoers in Northern Europe, let's say, is in the range of 3 to 8%. That is it. In Southern Europe and Germany, Austria, Netherlands, the range is 9 to 15%. Attend church weekly. Italy and Poland are countries that are really off charts with very high, well, still, we're talking about minorities, but comparatively, it's a very high proportion of churchgoers. On the right, in the right-hand panel, you can see data for Jews in Europe. It's taken from a very large survey of European Jews. We have about 17,000 observations there. And there people were asked how often you attend synagogue. And what you see here, that the proportion of people who attend synagogue weekly or more often among Jews is 23%, right? Across all denominations. How it compares to here, it's higher, significantly higher than here, or here it compares, it's basically the level is Italian. If you ask, okay, who drives this high rate? Is it the strictly Orthodox? No, not particularly. Yes, the impact on it, but first of all, there are not that many of them on a European scale. Their attendance obviously is very, very regular. It's also people who call themselves Orthodox, so the mainstream Orthodox. They're not strictly Orthodox. You wouldn't necessarily identify them as Jews on the street, for example, not visible. So much so, this pattern is very, very strong. So Reform and Progressive Jews that are known, they stick to the ritual in a significantly lighter manner. Their rate of synagogue attendance is about 19%. Again, it's higher than anywhere else. I don't think that's known at all. This is a very significant factor that would drive anything, I would say any illness, contagious illness. It's only natural to expect that people who meet together for ritual, but also for food, also for drinks, and greet each other in such a warm manner, it's quite clear that these contexts will effortlessly create a hub for very contagious diseases. I will conclude now, and I will say that generally what the take-home lessons here is those Jews generally are long lifers, and that conclusion is supported by research for the past 100 years, and it was confirmed by our research in the context of pandemic. When this is not the case, i.e. when we see Jews living shorter lives or having higher mortality, it's due to some sort of transient, what was called ephemeral factor. In the past, it was migration history. Today, it is COVID, and it can happen, I maintain, with any other highly contagious disease. We suspect that the key to it all is greater sociability. We have a lot of data to support this already, but obviously, as with any subject, certainly with any social scientific subject, some more evidence is needed. Thank you very much. I have come to the end of my piece. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. That was typically insightful and typically clear and interesting. It was really, really enjoyable and fascinating presentation. I meant to say at the beginning that as a researcher, you've so often explored the territory beyond headlines and beyond the sort of conclusions of people whose work relies to a far lesser degree on the type of evidence that you use and that you rely on. And this is another great example, I think, of where your work has looked beyond the headlines and looked beyond the anecdotal. And for that, I remain genuinely grateful. So I'm going to now open up some questions, and I hope to get through them. So I'm going to take them not exactly in order, but I want to take one from one of our attendees. And this comment, Daniel, you might like to reflect on and respond to. We'll do them one at a time so they don't sort of stack up. So I'll just read it verbatim. Many Jews actually do not attend synagogue so often, and most religious institutions were closed for long times during the pandemic. How would you respond to that statement?
It's important to emphasize that the results, the most typical results that I presented, belong to the first wave of the pandemic. And that's their strength. That's their strength because everybody came unprepared for the first wave of the pandemic. The virus was basically in the population without people realizing that. So we could say, arguably, that what we see during the picture during the first wave of the pandemic reflects unprepared population. As simple as that. When measures were introduced, Jews and others followed them. And what we could see in Britain, I'm still not in a position to show this in other countries. The data are not ready. But in Britain, we could see that. And the Institute for Jewish Policy Research published a paper 2 days ago on that topic. That in a second wave, we do not see Jewish penalty in Britain any longer. We still see elevated mortality among Jews from COVID, but it is as elevated as it is elevated anywhere in London. So yes, restrictions helped, and obviously, by and large, Jews followed them, and that had its effect. But during the first wave of the pandemic, we could see, and I hypothesize, the distilled impact of greater sociability in unprepared population.
And if I can play devil's advocate and ask a sort of slightly mischievous question, are you being polite when you say sociability? Do you really mean rule breaking during the first wave of the pandemic?
I actually think that the data that I presented perhaps in the last exhibit is strong enough to say to us this very thing. I mean, anyone who attended the synagogue, whether it's Orthodox synagogue or Reform synagogue, would notice one thing. When people sit close together, they sing for extended period of time together. When they leave the hall, they often leave to a hall where they eat together and exchange kisses, okay? I personally don't think that any rule breaking is needed, let's say, in this situation. We have a simpler explanation. If this community was very self-isolating in a way, we would have to reach for a different explanation. I also don't think, by the way, I really don't, that in a strictly Orthodox population, rule breaking was the key to their high prevalence of disease. And I will tell you why. In Britain, there is a very interesting piece of research that was conducted by LSHTM, London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, specifically in strictly Orthodox Jewish community. And they conducted it is a prevalence study with their findings you really cannot argue because they took blood samples from people and tried to understand whether people had antibodies for COVID in their blood. And what they showed is that the distribution of prevalences among strictly Orthodox Jews was very similar in shape, not in volume, but in shape to the rest of Britain, which means they had very strong peak of prevalence in the first wave, and then very sort of lull, and then another peak. So basically the graph for them of prevalences looks like two-humped camel. And that tells you one thing only, that the moment some sort of restrictions were imposed on them, they followed them because the pandemics receded very quickly. You couldn't see it if they decided to just not to pay attention. The distribution would look rectangular, something like rectangle, but they have this structure of basically a camel, which we see also in London and different. These very strong typical pandemic peaks, but I think people don't understand that the lull between them means that most people complied with it. And that's what basically you see among strictly Orthodox. So whether there was avoidance of rules in some corners of it, it doesn't particularly, yes, there may have been, just in the other populations it may have been, but by and large, that shape would not arise from systematic breaking of the rules.
And sort of segueing on from that, one of our attendees left a comment saying the virus was first communicated to Jewish communities at Purim. That was quite a dominant media narrative early on in 2020. Does the subsequent evidence support or challenge that as a possible super spreader event?
It's very difficult to say. It is true that Purim was slightly outside of the time of the rules, the social distancing rules, the restrictions that were imposed. It's quite possible. It's quite possible I wouldn't be able to. It's just one event. It's a massive event where people do exactly what I described. They come together, they kiss each other and hug each other more than once, and they eat together. And typically it's a party. It's a very joyous event. The focus is on children. So it is quite possible. It is quite possible that it's also important to understand that all of that happened before the time of restrictions. People were free to congregate. So it could be that basically created, it was a tailwind for sociability. Jews are more sociable, and that particular event, they were super social.
We had a series of comments and questions left by somebody who, according to their last comment, is also feeding a 1-year-old. And so I think by that they mean that they may have missed some part of your presentation. So without wanting to I invite you to repeat large sections of it. One of the questions, the comments and questions that were left by this person asks, if we imagine that there's a sequence of events, infection, illness, and death, where along that sequence does the first large discrepancy appear? So infection, illness, death, where does the Jewish penalty first appear, would you say?
What we documented is that the last station, if you wish. What we documented was Jewish penalty in death, with respect to death. And what we are saying that it is quite possible that that derives from greater presence of virus. So if we had a method of taking into account the amount of infected people, it could have been that we would have found that given that amount of affected people, Jewish mortality actually is low. It's not as high as it should have been, but we don't have that. We simply don't have that. All we have is Jewish penalty in death, and given the fact that we don't expect that the rest of causes behave normally, as we expect them, according to the old patterns, old school, always saying there's only one explanation to that, which is a much, much greater prevalence of illness. In strictly Orthodox communities, the prevalence of illness that the LSHTM study documented was among the highest in the world. In the world, something like 60% of people were found to have with antibodies. So that tells you it may not have been as high in outside of the strictly Orthodox, but it tells you the volume of it. I think in British population, London population, the prevalences are at the level of 9, 10, 11, 12%, something like this. Depends on when you look. So 12, 64.
Yeah.
12, 64. It's really, they're two different worlds.
So even though we don't have all the data we need to create a ratio of deaths and infection, we infer it from excess and antibodies, and is that kind of that's the so I suppose that's the conclusion. That's the inference made from those. Okay, right. Let me go back to some of these questions. Okay, so this is a long comment, which it'll be one of the last couple I'll read out. So here we go. You mentioned that it was not the Haredi factor, that the Haredi were not the reason why Jews were getting COVID more than others. But in the last few slides, it does seem to be driven by the Haredi because they are more social. So can you clarify, was it driven by the Haredi or not? It seems like it was, not because they weren't compliant, but because they were more social. So just a point of clarification there, I think, Daniel.
Yeah. I think this is what I'm going to say. We and it's not us, others documented beyond reasonable doubt that the presence of illness was higher among strictly Orthodox. And it is very much to be expected, not only that they're most sociable in a ritual sense, they are also larger families. So, the average family size is something like 4 or 5. An average TFR, the total fertility rate, is 7 per woman. It's large families. The virus becomes contagious very quickly, affects many people. That is the prevalence of illness, and that was higher. That higher prevalence of illness may have translated into slightly higher mortality. We don't know because we simply we haven't documented mortality of that particular group of strictly Orthodox. However, in the context of Britain, strictly Orthodox are simply at higher ages, at ages 65 plus, are such a small proportion of population. And we see elevated Jewish mortality, significantly elevated Jewish mortality in places that have zero Haredi. Anyhow, for example, in Scotland, for example, in other communities, that burial societies that have nothing to do with strictly Orthodox. So yes, the prevalence of illness is high, but among the Haredi, but it has no impact on the elevated mortality among Jews. And that is the main. So the Haredi are not this cannot be attributed to them, although their mortality is not known, but we can dismiss them as an explanation.
Yeah. A friend and colleague of mine from Bristol has left a typically robust question. I don't think we have time to address all of it, so I hope I'll be forgiven for summarising it down into 2 questions, which I think will be of interest to the whole group. So, first, has any of your work compared faith groups? So you compare Jews and non-Jews, but what about Jews and other specific faith groups? That's my first question. And the second question, some of your slides showed differences between Jews and non-Jews. Some of the differences were fairly small. I wondered how many of them were statistically significant. So in layman's terms, how many were real differences and how many were differences due to your research methods and sample sizes? So have you compared faith groups, and are we looking at real differences when you show us these differences?
So with respect to the first question, the answer is this. I haven't compared them, but the Office for National Statistics did. And I would say the significance of what they found is over and above the significance of what we found with respect to Jews, because they found something quite tremendous, which I think strengthens us in our research in Jewish mortality. They found that there are quite a few ethnic groups and religious groups that had elevated mortality from coronavirus. Other things being equal, and that's the important thing. So in case of, for example, Black population in Britain, or Muslim population in Britain, which are weaker socioeconomically, even when you controlled for socioeconomic factors, their mortality from COVID was higher. Now, in my view, this is not something that the Office for National Statistics said. This is not something that anyone said, in actual fact. The sociability hypothesis explains this very well indeed. So in this, our expectation, produced by years of research into normal conditions of mortality, where people mostly die from cardiovascular disease, from cancer, we think about low socioeconomic position as something that somehow dramatically shapes the trajectories, the patterns of mortality. That is correct. But with the mortality from contagious causes, that isn't, or that's only a part of the explanation. There's a considerable part that we sort of miss by this kind of traditional thinking, and this is shown to us by the ONS research that returns this particular finding. So some groups that are disadvantaged, let's say, we know that, having controlled them having removed this disadvantage, still leaves them with disadvantage and mortality. And other groups, such as Jews and Hindus, by the way, they are not disadvantaged in socioeconomic terms, yet their mortality from COVID very high. So we have to look outside of this socioeconomic explanation and ask what's common to these people. Perhaps sociability is common to them, different types. Yes, that's the first explanation. The second explanation is that the ratios that I have shown cover In the non-Jewish case, 100% of the population. So they don't come from samples so much. So in this particular case, I would say the question of statistical significance is trivial. The non-Jewish data comes from a very large population base. For example, population of Brussels, it's the 100% of deaths in non-Jewish population of Brussels, 100% in London, etc. In relation to Jewish deaths, yes, there are some communities where there's a small number. We have to take them with a degree of caution. But for example, Jewish population of Stockholm. So these are, I would say for now, these are illustrative. This is an illustration of the patterns. We will have more data from them in the future, which will make numbers simply bigger. And we'll have another sort of go at this, at creating a spectrum of vulnerabilities. But some things I would say already clear, very, very clear now. The larger communities, for example, Paris, they have, we're talking about thousands of deaths normally in the year. This is not small community.
Great. Okay. Thank you for that. It's such a great pleasure and privilege to have you with us this afternoon, Daniel. I really do thank you for giving your time and for such a fascinating and expert presentation. We have to wrap up now. It's actually gone 6 o'clock, and our next event will actually be the first week of September. I wish I could tell you that the Religion and Numbers team are all off to the beach for 2 months, but alas, we're not. But however, we thought we'd give you a break and we'd come back on September. I believe it's the first Thursday of September. So it just leaves me to thank you all for attending. I hope you can join us again for our final webinar in this series. And just on behalf of everyone, Daniel, a big thank you. And goodbye to everyone. Good night.
It is my honor and my pleasure to be here. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.